right, welcome back, everyone. My name is Sharifa, and I'm a private immigration attorney in Pikesville, Maryland, and a member of MSBA's Immigration Council. I first wanted to thank Mariam Sadiq, the main moderator for today, for spearheading this important panel. Mariam is the president of the Comac Foundation, which she started in August 2021 as Afghans began to be resettled in this area following the Taliban takeover. And the word Comac means help in Dari, as some of you, which some of you may know, which is what Mariam's definitely doing with organizing important panels such as this. So thank you so much, Mariam. Moving on to our third panel of the day, though, I have the pleasure of introducing Spojmie Ahmadi Nasari and Mariam Masumi Daoud, and reintroducing the fabulous Sharifa Abassi from panel 2 to discuss humanitarian parole in the context of the Afghan refugee crisis. Spojmie Nasari is the founder and principal attorney at the law office of Spojmie Nasari in California. Although she primarily focuses on family-based immigration, including U visas, T visas, VAWA, waivers, etc. She also serves on the board of Afghan American Community Organization, or the AACO, and is dedicated to serving the Afghan community. She's also on the board of the International Orphan Care Organization, the IOC, which is dedicated to helping orphans in Afghanistan. She served as on the board as president of the CARE Coalition for the San Francisco Bay Area chapter. This protects the civil rights of Muslim Americans in that area. And she's on AILA's Afghan task force, addressing the legal needs of Afghan evacuees. She's fluent in Pashto and Dari. She's spoken at numerous AILA conferences and other conferences locally and nationally on immigration law. She's a wonderful person to have on this panel. She has very intimate understanding of these issues. Mariam Masumi is the owner and managing attorney of Johnson and Masumi, an immigration law firm in Vienna, Virginia. She handles immigration matters for hundreds of clients throughout the states, both in removal proceedings and before USCIS, including P visas and humanitarian parole. Like myself and many of you, she graduated from the University of Baltimore School of Law after obtaining her bachelor's from George Mason. And as an Afghan American, she has taken a special interest in assisting Afghans with various immigration matters. Now, these wonderful attorneys can provide the perspective of whether humanitarian parole is even feasible and how we can best as practitioners demonstrate humanitarian considerations when seeking this form of relief. So thank you all for participating on this panel. And I guess you can choose how you'd like to address the topics individually, but I kind of wanted to start off with the general question of what is humanitarian parole?
Thank you so much, Sherry, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I am going to go ahead and talk about what humanitarian parole is, what the general application process is, what are the benefits associated with humanitarian parole, and then transition a little bit into the situation in Afghanistan and why so many Afghans have sought humanitarian parole following the US troop withdrawal and the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban. And this will hopefully set the stage and provide some context for what my fellow panelists will be discussing, which is the process for Afghans more specifically, as well as the current challenges associated with that. And they'll also touch on the current statistics on humanitarian parole applications for Afghans and how the process compares to that of other groups seeking humanitarian parole. And we do kind of hope to touch on a little bit on the process for Ukrainians, as that's also a topic of significant interest. So to answer your question, Sherry, humanitarian parole is something that allows an individual, regardless of whether they're inadmissible or not into the United States, to enter for a temporary period of time. And the decision to give somebody humanitarian parole is based on the discretion of the US Department of Homeland Security. And essentially, when a person is demonstrated that they have a need for parole, then they will be awarded the benefit of entry into the United States. The reason in which an individual can obtain parole is based on an urgent humanitarian reason, as well as a significant public benefit. And some of the reasons that the Department of Homeland Security has traditionally granted parole are situations where an individual may want to obtain medical treatment or provide support to a seriously ill or terminally ill relative, or to attend a funeral, or in this particular case, to obtain protection from targeted or individualized harm. And so if parole is authorized, it's typically not granted for any longer than 1 year. But the parole period can be specified based on the period of time in which it takes a person to accomplish the purpose of the parole. So for example, if somebody's coming here for a court proceeding, they can be given parole for the period of time it takes for that court proceeding to conclude. And parole is something that, again, is temporary. It's a temporary admission into the United States. It does end. It can end on the date of expiration that's given on the parole document. It's also something that can end when somebody leaves the United States, when they depart the United States. And it can also end when a person acquires the benefit of an immigration status, like a green card. So once they obtain a green card, their parole status ends. The Department of Homeland Security can also revoke parole at any time and without notice if it determines that somebody no longer warrants parole. And another big question that often comes up with what humanitarian parole is, people want to know who can apply for it. And it can really be applied for by anyone. Anyone can request parole for themselves, or somebody can apply for parole on behalf of another person. And you have to go through an application process with USCIS in order to go forward with parole. And the application has to include supporting documents that would support the request for parole. There's also a filing fee associated with that of $575. And if a person can't pay that fee, there is an opportunity to apply for a fee waiver. If the Department of Homeland Security grants it, then the case can go forward without a fee. And once a person submits the application, it's known as the Form I-131, an application for travel document. Then they go ahead and get that to USCIS. And again, it's not just an application. A person definitely wants to submit supporting evidence to corroborate the reason why they're requesting parole. Once it's sent to USCIS, it's looked at by the Humanitarian Affairs Branch, the HAB for short, HAB, and they initially look at it to make sure that they have jurisdiction to decide the case. For example, if somebody is seeking parole into the United States after having been deported, then the HAB wouldn't have jurisdiction over that. ICE would have jurisdiction over that. So they first look at it to make sure that they have jurisdiction. And if they decide they have jurisdiction, they would then look at it to see if there's any sort of time-sensitive reason for them to expedite the case, and then they make a decision on it. They're supposed to look at the evidence that's been provided, and if the USCIS officer that's looking at the case makes a decision, then a supervisor has to review that decision. And ultimately, when the decision is made, the person who is seeking the parole will be notified of the decision. If a parole is conditionally authorized, then an approval notice will be mailed to all the parties involved. And it will then contain information on the next steps that the person has to take to obtain the travel documents to come to the United States. And USCIS also notifies the US Embassy or consulate that's closest to the person who's seeking parole. And obviously, if the case is denied, the case stops there. So if a person's request for parole is authorized, then they're going to be notified to complete a DS-160, which is a application for non-immigrant visa. And then they have to appear at the consulate or embassy that's closest to them. They have to go through additional security screenings, like biometrics and vetting and all of that. And then if nothing negative pops up for that person and they're able to be given the parole, then the US consulate is going to go ahead and issue something known as a boarding foil, which will allow the beneficiary of the parole to come to the United States. And they have to do that within about 30 days. And once they come into the United States, CBP inspects the individual. They'll give them an I-94. They'll say how long they can stay in the United States, and then they can also ultimately apply for a work permit through the filing of a Form I-765. that's a general process. That's who can apply, what steps are normally taken in order to achieve this process that so many have applied for. It's also really important to note, though, that normally USCIS gets about 2,000 of these applications a year. And so then we have the situation that took place in Afghanistan, where the Taliban took over on August 15th of 2021. And then the United States and other troops who were in Afghanistan for about 2 decades subsequently withdrew from the country, and they evacuated about 130,000 Afghans. And for the United States, it was one of the largest mass air evacuations in US history. And about 76,000 of those people were brought into the US, and they were given humanitarian parole for about 2 years, which is a little bit outside of the 1 year that we normally see. And with that military evacuation effort, it was something that did help a certain number of people, but there's so many individuals who still need protection and who are vulnerable in Afghanistan, which is now run by the Taliban. And so now the question comes, why humanitarian parole for Afghans? Why did this become something that resulted in these massive number of applications being sent to the HAB? And one of the big reasons is humanitarian parole. It's been utilized in the past to provide safe passage for large numbers of people. We have Vietnam as an example. After the fall of Saigon, the United States established a parole program to evacuate about 140,000 Vietnamese refugees. And they've also used humanitarian parole in other situations for Cubans, for Central American minors, the CAM program. So a lot of people hoped that this might be like a flexible mechanism for Afghans who supported the United States, who were able to provide that they have this evidence that they're going to be in danger for their lives because of the work they may have done on behalf of the US military in the past, or their role as women in various structures in the government. So there was this imminent need for protection, and other immigration pathways were just not optimal. It just wasn't very possible to get that fast route to the United States for that protection. For instance, the refugee program, that takes several years for people to be admitted to the United States. And there were a lot of changes made to that program under the Trump administration, which unfortunately resulted in a lot of resources lacking from the program. The program became very overwhelmed, and it just takes many years. There's also hurdles for people with the family-based immigration process. It takes many years for citizens and residents who are trying to bring preference category relatives to come to the United States. I've personally seen a lot of people who are from Afghanistan that have siblings in Afghanistan, and their number one question is, well, I'm a citizen. Can I bring my brother or sister? And unfortunately, I have to tell them that it takes at least a minimum of 15 years for a case to be processed, for a visa to be available. So as a result of all these challenges, many Afghans remain in Afghanistan with these imminent threats to their life, and so many hoped that humanitarian parole would be that mechanism to allow them to process to come into the United States in a faster way. And so although USCIS normally receives about 2,000 of these in a year, there's been about 45,000 received in less than a year from Afghans only. So kind of with that summary, I know I went a lot longer than what your initial question was, but I was going to go ahead and transition to Sharifa Abassi, and I think she can give some great information on the process for Afghans and the challenges that Afghans are facing as a result of the current humanitarian parole adjudications process and some of the priorities that they have in place.
Hi, everyone. Mariam, thank you so much for that very, very useful and beneficial information. Thank you for sharing all of that. So as Mariam said, with the fall of Kabul and the troops withdrawal, there was a lot of panic, I would say, in the Afghan community, both in Afghanistan and here in the Afghan community in the United States, because like so many Afghans, all of us still have relatives back home. So with the troops withdrawing and then, the evacuation efforts underway, there was a lot of panic, both here and there. And like Mariam said, the most obvious solution to this and to get everyone here the fastest, the quickest way possible was humanitarian parole. That is something that came to the mind of many advocates for clients and families that were reaching out to them. Like Mariam said, humanitarian parole has been something that has always been around. I think with all the attention that it received from all the Afghans applying for it. Everyone thinks this is like, something new that has just been created for the Afghans, but no, like she said, in fact, this has been around for a long time and has in fact been used previously in a situation like this. Um, so with Afghans, and given the obstacles with the family-based petitions, the family-based process of bringing here, and then also with the refugee programs, the backlog with that, the only solution that we saw, the feasible solution that we saw was humanitarian parole for everyone who could not make it here through the evacuation effort. Um, so the problem with that is, and I will just speak, I guess, from my own personal experiences when, August, September, around August, September, even October, everybody was pushing humanitarian parole. I think even USCIS even put up a page for humanitarian parole for Afghans. It seemed like everybody was pushing humanitarian parole. And so that's why all of these Afghans, they saw humanitarian parole as the golden ticket, as the only option out for them. And I will be honest with you, when people were calling me and they were calling my office to get these petitions filed for their family, I was not a big proponent of it then, and I'm not a big proponent of it now. And I did tell them that, this is not, the standard for this kind of application is very, very high. And the chances of approval is very slim. But nonetheless, because of all of the attention and all of the push that it was getting from the media, everybody, someone that's stuck back home that has no knowledge of immigration law, they thought that this is really their only way out. Now, the challenge with the humanitarian parole for Afghans is one that there's two applications that the process entails, which is one is an I-131, and then the second application is a I-134. So you not only need to file the application for humanitarian parole, but the I-134 is the affidavit of support. So you sort of need a financial sponsor, someone that is basically can confirm that they can sponsor, basically meet your financial needs while you're here, provide housing and finances for you while here. So with many Afghans, that was the challenge that they were facing, is that they actually had to find somebody here who was, had sufficient income, whose income was above the poverty guidelines, and who could in fact sponsor a family of a large size or whatever size. And they would need to submit their tax returns and so on and so forth. So that was one of the challenges, is, even if they had family members here, the family members, because they weren't here for a long time themselves, they didn't have, very well-paying jobs. They weren't not able to meet the income requirements for the I-134. So that created one obstacle. The other obstacle with Afghans is that, after the fall of Kabul, the embassy also in Kabul closed down. There was no embassy in Kabul. And like Mariam said, for the humanitarian parole process, after the application is approved here, a DS-160 needs to be filed, and then the individual needs to be scheduled for an interview at an embassy, at a local embassy. Normally, they would have been scheduled for an interview at the embassy in Kabul, where they would have gone through an interview and screening process and then issued a boarding foil. There was no embassy in Kabul. So the issue, or the second obstacle for Afghans, is that we basically had to transfer the case to a third country for them to go there for an interview. And given the political climate in that area, in that between Afghanistan and Pakistan and the surrounding countries, a lot of those countries were not accepting of Afghans. So it's not very easy to transfer a case to an embassy in Pakistan or to an embassy in Tajikistan. A lot of those embassies, straight up told us we're not accepting Afghan cases. So that was the other challenge. Then came November, and USCIS had a stakeholder meeting for which, in which I engaged. I actually took part in that meeting, and they finally told us, hey, sorry to break the bad news for you guys, but we're not going to approve a lot of these applications, even though they made millions in filing fees, because like Mariam said, each application has a filing fee of $575. And the application for humanitarian parole, like I said, it requires two applications, the I-131 and the I-134. An application needs to be filed for each individual person. It's not like one application covers an entire family. Each family member needs their own separate application and their own separate filing fee. So there was millions that was filed in filing fees. And as of right now, as the statistics currently hold, like she said, there was a total of 45,360 humanitarian parole applications filed by Afghans. Out of all those applications, 42,770 of those applications are currently pending. 2,250 applications were denied. And out of all those applications, out of the 45,000, more than 45,000 applications that were filed, only 340 were conditionally approved. What does conditional approval mean? So a lot of these people that did file for humanitarian parole, they were in Afghanistan. And because there's no embassy in Afghanistan, if your case makes it through all the different obstacles and you actually do get a conditional approval, the conditional approval is basically that we are conditionally approving it right now, but it's contingent on you being able to prove that you're in a different country, in a third country, where we can move forth with the consular processing or the interview of the case. So that's where they are right now. The other challenge that I saw with a lot of cases that I filed for Afghans, the denials that a lot of us were getting is because the standard was just like, forget high standard, it was completely absurd. Like, we had a client of ours who was an actual SIV client who had an special immigrant visa pending. He had significant threats from the Taliban. We had evidence of it, affidavits from him, but they denied his application on two grounds. First, they said that if you're an SIV applicant, if you don't have COM approval, which is, one of the initial stages of the SIV application, we will not grant you humanitarian parole. Now, the issue that we saw with that is that if that was the case, we had several different meetings. There's a humanitarian parole page for Afghans. None of this was ever mentioned to us, that an SIV applicant needs COM approval before they can be approved. That's basically a preliminary condition for approval of humanitarian parole. That was never communicated to us or anywhere at all. It was just, that was once they got this application before them, that was the standard that they imposed. Because our client had, in fact, by the time when we had filed the application, he didn't have his COM approval, but while the application was pending, he had received COM approval. We just didn't think that that was important for us to update because they had never told us that that was necessary. That was one of the standards. And then the second reason, which is completely absurd, is that they basically wanted and I think this is this is the standard they used for many of the cases that they denied, is that they wanted they actually wanted a letter from a third party highlighting the imminent threats to you. So in essence, they want a letter from the Taliban saying that, hey, we're coming after you, and these are you're basically on our blacklist, which is impossible for somebody in that situation to get. So with standards like that, and using that very, very absurd standard, that's how they've been denying all these applications. We had several meetings with the USCIS team, and their reasoning behind the denial of these applications or this process is that, hey, humanitarian parole was created only for very specific situations, very specific reasons, and if we have a massive or people trying to come here in masses, that's what we have the U.S. refugee program and they have to come through the regular refugee channels, but they don't understand that the refugee channels, that regular refugee channels are completely backlogged and takes years, and these people would need to go to a third country for which they don't have the finances, the resources to live in another country for that many years while their refugee case is pending. And I mean, this was something that was brought to their attention by many advocates in the community. They know of this. And with that, I mean, I'll end this because it's unfortunate that even with all of our advocacy and our pushing, that stands to be the standard for humanitarian parole when it comes to Afghans, but that's not what it is with the Ukrainians. And with that, I'll let my colleague Spojmie take over. Thank you.
Good morning or good afternoon to you guys. Thank you, Mariam, John, and Sharifa, John, for that historical perspective and the current perspective. The biggest challenge I saw, I mean, over the years, I've filed, several humanitarian parole. And as I think the numbers were given before this, maybe about 2,000 humanitarian parole applications were filed and a couple hundred got approved. I would wholeheartedly say I was pessimistic from the beginning that HP would work. And I echo Margaret. I think she was one of the first few ones that filed a lot of them, and she was getting approval. So all of us were excited to see that. But then as she was getting some of those, it abruptly stopped, right? And the census, I think, is that from the higher up, there was some directive to state that they weren't going to take the humanitarian parole out for Afghans. What's disheartening is imagine the physical aspect of trying to get out of Afghanistan and being told that in order to continue your HP, you got to be in a third country. When you get to the third country, you're literally told you're safe now, therefore your HP is not going to go through. 20 years of Afghan blood, 20 years of Afghan allyship. Yes, I talked to some of my colleagues that say, well, we didn't have planes going to evacuate my people from a certain country. They're lucky that they got planes. If you watch that evacuation, for lack of better words, it was a shit show. I saw the suicide bombers. I saw the videos of blood. I saw people stampede. I've been to 7 of the 8 military bases to see the need to be with family separated. A quick story of a gentleman in his 60s, maybe 70s, grabbing his little daughter by the hand, telling me in Pashto, what am I going to do with her? And I'm like confused, like, what do you mean? Wife was stampeded at the airport. Children were separated. So there are hundreds and thousands of Afghan families that were separated. I'm not advocating open the door and let all the Afghans come in, but there has to be a better way than the way we've been doing it. Because we're seeing right now how they're doing it right with the Ukrainians. When I'm speaking with my colleagues about the Ukrainian process, I mean, I'm not pitting Ukrainians against Afghans. I'm holding the government accountable for the disparity in the treatment for the Afghans versus other groups. And that goes for the Haitians who were beaten on horses at the border. That goes for the Central Americans. But I'm saying that the treatment disparity, a couple of us, including myself, Afghan leaders, were on a call with Secretary Mayorkas, who flat out said the humanitarian parole process was not meant to circumvent the immigration process. And no, we are not going to waive the fees for this process because it takes services to do that. So it's disheartening. From day one when Kabul fell, many of us here have been on hundreds of different calls, colleagues and allies from every vet group, from everybody trying to get this administration to change that. So how is the humanitarian parole different from the process that my co-panelists talked about versus the Ukrainians? Some of you may have done it. I've done 3 in the last week for humanitarian. For Ukrainians, you literally go and fill out an I-134 and you put in the income information, you upload the documents, and there's supposed to be a decision made in about 7 days. So how is it that this administration is able to tell us that there are obstacles for Afghans to be able to come in, and then that the process is complicated for Afghans, and that there's all these processes going? I know also when people were seeking entry at the southern border for Afghans, mind you, Mexico doesn't give visas to Afghans. Mind you that the process now has changed. The Ukrainians are also not being allowed in at the border. They must go through the process and file this application. Anybody can be a sponsor. Thousands upon thousands of RFEs are being issued for the Afghan humanitarian parole. Many are being denied. It's just like a circular path that we're going through without an answer. What can be done about the disparity? I think collectively, as part of, Margaret's part of it, others are part of the AILA, Afghan Response Task Force. Many other groups have been advocating for the change in the humanitarian parole process for Afghans. And we have to keep demanding that because there is a means to be able to unite these families. Now, I know, again, we're not going to be able to bring every single Afghan that's seeking it, but for example, there are hundreds and thousands of documentally ready cases that the National Visa Center which the Kabul is not able, there's no embassy there, so therefore they must be processed. They have to get a visa to Pakistan or another country to continue those processes. A lot of my clients are spouses of SIDs, so they're green card holders, they're spouses of SIDs, which their lives are in danger. So collectively, we need to continue to seek that. But in reality, it's not DHS. I think there's a directive, like, it was echoed in some of the messages, that there's a directive from the higher up not to process HPs for Afghans. Millions and millions and millions of dollars have been made. I know personally when I was helping a couple of clients pro bono do the HP, even though personally I didn't really think it was going to work. And unfortunately, we are seeing that. But everybody was trying to do everything they could to help Afghans desperately seeking to get out. Is that my humble request is, one, try to figure out a system to be able to allow these Afghans who had filed for HP to be able to come in. And if that's not going to happen, I would demand that they return the money. Because the HP for the Ukrainians, if you filed humanitarian parole prior to them rolling out this U4U application process for Ukrainians, which is an online I-134, you don't even need an I-131, which is what was needed for Afghans. You had to do an I-131, I-134, extensive documentation, extensive statement telling them why the person was in danger and they needed to seek protection and be able to come. So people had to scramble in such a short time and do all of that. And at the end of it, there's no results. Whereas for the Ukrainians, for those of you who may have already done it or you're looking to do it, it's a very streamlined process. They said they're supposed to make a decision in 7 days. We'll have to see how that goes. I filed a couple this week. It literally took me, I told my client what documentation I need in terms of the taxes, literally took me 35 minutes. That's how streamlined the process is. And I hope that they're able to come in, and I hope that they continue to get the support. So collectively, what we can do is we can, voice our concern. But at the end of the day, my humble opinion is, I think the Biden administration higher up just doesn't give a shit. So that's my 2 cents. I think it's a racist policy. We're not blue-eyed Christian civilized Europeans. So therefore, what was done for the Afghans, we should be happy with what we got, with the 20 years of service that we gave. So I will leave it up. We have 13 minutes to leave it up to you. Open up the floor. And sorry if I sound bitter, but having done this from day one when Kabul fell, seeing all of the emotion that all of us, Sharifa, John, I don't know, Mariam, John, if you've gone to the bases, but seeing the heartache of everybody. And I had the pleasure of being on some of the bases with Sharifa, and it hits home. And I would say it hits home because as an Afghan American refugee, all of us are, children of refugees, or we are refugees ourselves. And to see, yes, a lot of great work has been done, but a lot more needs to be done. So I will leave the floor open for any questions that you guys might have, and whether it's the Afghan process or the Ukrainian. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And I actually do have a clarifying question. Did you identify that parole is not available for either Ukrainians or Afghan refugees at the border, at the southern border?
That is my understanding. So I was speaking with a colleague yesterday that the Ukrainians are being turned away. They have to file, so they can, if they're in Mexico, I believe they can file in Mexico City. So right now we just fill out the I-134, and then they sent out an email letting them know what the process is going to be. But in general, there was a misunderstanding amongst the community that, or at least the Afghan community, that there were thousands of Afghans at the time they were letting them in, that Afghans were not letting me in. That was not true, because there was about 500 Afghans in the Mexico City that were eventually paroled in through the parole process, but Afghans in general could not get a visa to Mexico. So there wasn't a lot of Afghans seeking, but maybe someone else can echo, but as far as I know, the Ukrainians have to go through the new U4U process, and they can do that in Mexico City.
All right, it looks like we do have quite a bit of questions. So let me see, let me go up top. Margaret had quite a bit of clarifying information added as well. All right, we have a question from Anshu. Is the process the same regardless of where the applicant is, i.e. inside or outside of the US? So is the I-134 and the I-131 filed to the same place, or what is the process? And that question can go out to any of you who'd like to answer.
Is that pertaining to Afghans or Ukrainians? Because the processes are different.
For Afghans.
Mariam, John, Sharifa, John, you guys wanna?
Yeah, the
So go ahead,
ahead.
Mary.
So the process, this application process is essentially the same, but where the challenge is for Afghans is that if you're inside of Afghanistan, USCIS has a policy that indicates that they cannot continue processing the application for humanitarian parole. So when an individual does get to a third country, it's at that time that they're able to resume processing. And that's also something that's kind of confused me, because the language on the USCIS website says that they can't continue to process, but if they do process your case, they'll tell you, hey, we've started processing and you need to go to a third country. And once you make it to a third country, you need to let us know so that we can continue processing the case. So again, although the process isn't necessarily that different, the forms are the same, it's still sent to USCIS. The way in which a person will have their case proceed with USCIS is different depending on where they are, whether they're in Afghanistan or outside of Afghanistan.
So in terms of the Ukrainian, as Margaret stated, there were a few Afghans that were able to get in, and it is at the discretion of CBP. But the issue was people were thinking there were thousands of Afghans at the southern border, and that wasn't the case. But there were a few that probably got paroled in, and then they got NTA'd, which I know a particular family, they were NTA'd. And they weren't paroled in under the Evacuator Allies program that everyone else was. And they ended up in a homeless shelter and they needed help. So they were fundraising for them, but very few.
So it appears right now that the consensus is that humanitarian parole is not a viable option for Afghans. Do we have a sense of what, when clients call looking for hope, what we really should be advising on the humanitarian parole side? Should we be advocating if you can get to a port to request for parole from CBP, or what is the consensus on that issue? Because a lot of the time, of course, they're looking for hope, but we don't want to give false hope.
Well, first and foremost, I'll let my colleagues and panelists speak. First and foremost, it's really hard for Afghans to get out of Afghanistan right now. If they had managed to already get out and get to a port, and they're at the port of entry, I would say, yes, go ahead. But I would never tell anyone to go ahead, try to get out of Afghanistan, because, I mean, the journey is just unimaginable and the costs are unimaginable. But if somebody's already there at the port, you know, yes, they can certainly seek, but it's not something that I would advocate. And as far as HP, you can ask for a fee waiver. If you're able to get a fee waiver and file for someone and get a petition in the hopes that maybe the administration will change and you have a petition in, then yes. If you want to cough up the 575 and hope that it might work in the long term, I'm very realistic. I give hope, but I'm also realistic, and I'll let my panelists echo what their thoughts are.
Yeah, no, it's definitely like, to echo what Spojmie said, it is very challenging for Afghans to leave Afghanistan as it is. I think they can get to 24 destinations without having a visa or with being able to apply for a visa on arrival. And all of those destinations, none of them are neighboring countries. And it's very difficult for them to leave the borders of Afghanistan, let alone to make it to some of these other countries. Obviously, if they do make it to a port of entry at the United States, they could certainly try to request it. I don't see the harm in it, especially if they've made it there. But for those who personally come to my office and ask for advice on whether they should apply for humanitarian parole, I basically lay out the same information that we've shared with everybody today, which are those statistics that the program has appeared to have come to a halt as it pertains to Afghans. I personally haven't heard of any approvals coming out or even denials coming out in the last few months, and advise them that it may not go anywhere and that it could be several months, if not longer, before they even hear anything. And obviously, if the relative is inside of Afghanistan, there's those logistical challenges of even being able to proceed on the parole because there is no US embassy in Afghanistan where they could finalize the process. So I think just being very honest and open with clients about what the challenges currently are, so that they have an expectation. If you deal with, Afghans, like really any population, they always just want, the answers. They want to know, like, when is this going to get approved? Is there a chance? Is there hope? And I think setting that realistic expectation is super important.
And I also just wanted to reiterate that I also echo what they say, what Mariam and Spojmie said. The other challenge that I was facing is that USCIS said that they would prioritize those cases for those who are outside of Afghanistan in a third country. So after that, anyone that was calling me, when I would tell them that hey, if you're in Afghanistan, your case is basically, even if we file HP for you, it's going to get moved to the back of the line. And then they would pose me with the very difficult question, oh, then should I go and relocate to a third country? And that's always a hard question, a difficult question for a practitioner to answer, especially, considering that we're in the US. And I would just tell them that I'm not in the best position to answer this question for you because I know there are grave risks in trying to leave the country. And then once you get to a third country, we have no idea how long this application is going to take. And even if we get a decision, we don't know what the chances of approval is. So there was many times that we were faced with that difficult question. Unfortunately, a lot of our clients are in that situation right now where they're just waiting in a third country, waiting to hear something back. And like she said, like Mariam said, they constantly call us to give them definite answers or to give them a timeline, but unfortunately none of us have any control over that.
And I just wanted to echo what Margaret was saying. If somebody's at the border and they're able to retain an attorney, I mean, obviously they have a leverage because an attorney on this side can try to advocate with CBP and appeal to the humanitarian side and possibly try to get that person. It's always more advantageous when you do have an attorney advocating for you. And then again, Margaret is saying that, there's a different treatment in terms of policy for Afghans. She had an Iraqi client who was able to get HP during that time that Afghans were seeking it. So I do humbly believe that higher up Biden administration has given a directive and that DHS and Mayorkas and all of them are just echoing what they're being told. And so with the last 4 minutes that we have, what can we do about it? If anybody's interested in trying to get into some sort of advocacy work on behalf of Afghans, and then a separate topic, not in this discussion, but just to keep it up there, is that the need for legal services for Afghans is dire. The last 8 months we've spent trying to get pro bono services for Afghans. I know Ayla has been on the task force trying to push for pro bono services, ABA, and a lot of other people. We're not getting the momentum. And now with the Ukrainians coming in, there is a lot of interest in helping Ukrainians file for asylum. So, which will put Afghans more on the back burner. And the 1-year deadline is approaching. And I know there's an exception to the rules, but if you are interested in taking on some cases, I was just on a call with the USCIS yesterday. They're trying to get some federal funding that would channel to nonprofits and possibly get nonprofits to subcontract to private attorneys at low bono costs. So if you are interested in helping taking on, some asylum cases, or you want to do some advocacy work around this humanitarian parole disparate treatment, feel free to reach to Mariam Siddiqui and she can connect us and we can collectively. But we've been pushing and it hasn't been, as much as we would like it. So thank you everyone for joining today.
Thank you all for your realistic perspectives on this. And I'm excited for the last panel, which are alternative and creative options that these clients may explore as opposed to humanitarian parole. So right now we're gonna go ahead and take our 15-minute break. We're gonna rejoin at 1:30 and we thank the panelists for their time today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.